Okay. Dear special guest, distinguished speaker, dear audience. As the research director at the Department of Economics of the Universidad de Rosario, and member of the Comité Autónomo de la Regla Fiscal CARF, it is an honor for me to start the launch of the 2023 edition of the World Economic Outlook of the International Monetary Fund. This event has been organized by three institutions: the Universidad de los Andes, the Comité Autónomo de la Regla Fiscal, the Universidad de Rosario, and of course, the members of the International Monetary Fund. It is part of a series of events that the three institutions will jointly organize during the year. In the first part of today's conference, Josef Platzer, Adrian Peralta, and JaeBin will present 2, 3, and 4, the chapter 2, 3, and 4 of the World Economic Outlook. These chapters address exciting aspects of the link between the natural interest rate and economic growth. Complementary to this subject, they analyze the strategies to tackle increasing public debt, and finally, they show the interaction between geo-economic fragmentation and foreign direct investment. In the second part of the conference, Sylvia Escovar and Andrés Zambrano will comment on the chapter presented previously. Finally, the speakers and discussants will answer questions from the audience and hold a final discussion. To officially start this event, let me introduce our speakers and discussants. Josef Platzer is an economist at the Western Hemisferio Department of the International Monetary Fund. Adrian Peralta is Deputy Division Chief in the Research Department of the International Monetary Fund. JaeBin is an economist at Research Department of the International Monetary Fund. Sylvia Escovar is a member of the several national and international committees and member of the Comité Autónomo de la Regla Fiscal. Finally, Andrés Zambrano is a professor at the Department of Economics of the Universidad de los Andes and an advisor to the board of the Comité Autónomo de la Regla Fiscal. Let's welcome the presenters and start the conference. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting us. We are very excited to be here. So I will start with a chapter on the natural rate of interest, drivers and policy implications, and just a word to the students that watch online. So you might think interest rates is not a very exciting topic, but believe me, policymakers pay a lot of attention to the natural rate of interest. So it pays off to pay attention. Okay, let me give a motivation. So with inflation and public debt at high levels, there is a lot of interest recently on the level of the natural rate of interest, especially from policymakers. To fix ideas, under the natural rate of interest, we understand the rate of interest at which the output gap is closed and inflation is stable and on target. So it is the level of interest where monetary policy is neither contractionary nor expansionary. The natural rate of interest is driven by structural forces and a key input for monetary policy and for debt sustainability. It acts as a long-term anchor for real interest rates, And so I think it makes sense to first look at some data. So here I plot two panels or two charts, and they show real interest rates. On the top panel or several maturities for US interest rates. And at the bottom panel, you see the 5 largest advanced economies and the short-term real interest rates going back to the 1980s. And what we see is a decade-long downward trend. And this trend, we are not the first one to point that out. It's a known fact by now. What I want to point out that was interesting, that over this period, so we saw real interest rates come down, and at the same time, we saw inflation come down in these countries or stay stable. So this points to structural forces being behind this long-run downward trend of interest rates. We also see that recently, since 2020, there was an increase, and you see it particularly well in the top figure. And this, of course, is related to policymakers raising interest rates to fight inflation. Now, a natural question that arises is, will this be a temporary increase in interest rates, or is it a more permanent development? So this brings me to the key questions we address in this chapter. First one, we look to the past and ask how have natural rates developed, and we try to estimate their decline. And then the second question is we go a step deeper and ask what are the driving forces behind this decline. And then third, of course, very relevant for policymakers, what's the outlook for natural interest rates? So the way we answer these questions is we have a two-pronged approach. So natural interest rates, they are not directly observable, so you cannot just go to the data and look what the natural rate is. The natural rate is a theoretical construct, and it has to be estimated. So with this comes, unfortunately, large error or large uncertainty what the accurate level is of natural rates. And to address this and to give some robustness to our conclusions, we use two approaches. We use two separate frameworks to look at natural rates. So the first one is more a data-focused approach. So to say, we let the data speak. So this is an approach developed by Laubach and Williams, two economists. It relies on a minimal set of theoretical assumptions and some data inputs, aggregate variables like inflation, output, and interest rates. And yeah, so as such, not much inputs are needed for this approach, but it comes with downsides. The first one I already mentioned, it's large uncertainty. And second, it doesn't tell us much about underlying drivers behind the change in natural rates. So this is where the second framework comes in. That's a larger structural model. And it allows us to decompose movements in the natural rate of interest into various drivers. And if you follow this discussion, so some drivers that are often mentioned are demographic change, a slowdown in productivity growth, rise in inequality, and capital flows, among others. We calibrate this model to the largest advanced economies and emerging markets. And we also use the model to give an outlook for the natural rate. Let me give you the key takeaways from the chapter. First, we find that our two-pronged approach pays off. Both approaches give a similar decline for the natural rate when we look back over the last 4 decades, and we find about a 2 percentage point decline in the natural rate in advanced economies. Next, behind this downward trend are mostly an aging population and slower TFP growth. Fiscal policy is another important contributor, but counteracts. So without, let's say, a rise in public debt, the natural rate would have declined even further. And then we find some cross-country variations, especially in emerging markets. Picture looks a bit different. When it comes to the outlook, we find that the low interest rate world that we found ourselves in before the pandemic will likely continue, or we will likely find ourselves again in a low interest rate world. With an important caveat, this is once the inflation is brought back to target. And For emerging markets, we find a gradual convergence over the decades to advanced economy levels. And then what are the policy implications from this outlook? First, for monetary policy, we find that, so given our outlook, the effective lower bound on interest rates will likely become a constraint again for monetary policy. And this is especially in recession. So, when we hear about that the interest rates go to zero, central banks lower interest rates to zero, and then they have to use unconventional policy like quantitative easing. So this would suggest that considerations like that will stay relevant. And then we also have an implication for fiscal policy. So you might think that low interest rates are good news for when it comes to debt trajectories or debt developments. However, we find that the same forces that put downward pressure on the interest rate also lower growth. And you might know that R minus G, or interest rates minus growth, is an important number when it comes to debt sustainability. So ultimately what we find that if countries want to stabilize their debt over the long run, we still need substantial consolidation. Okay, now let's start with this first approach we use, which is the famous Laubach and Williams approach. So this approach relies on a set of standard macro relationships and has as inputs aggregate data such as interest rates, output, and inflation. And so if you look at this model, it very much looks like a standard New Keynesian model. And this means also the intuitions from the New Keynesian model, they kind of transfer to the Laubach and Williams model. So we can write this framework, we can rewrite it as a Kalman filter, and then a Kalman filter tells us what's the most likely path of an unobserved variable, in this case, the natural rate of interest. We estimate this model for 6 advanced economies with sufficient data before the pandemic. And here on the left, you find our results. So we have here the 6 economies, and in black, you see the change in the natural interest rate between the late 1970s and before the pandemic. And you see that across the 6 countries, the natural rate went down by about 2 percentage points. You also see that the confidence intervals are quite large. I mean, I already mentioned this. This comes with this approach. And then the third line you see, or the third result, so to say, you see here in blue the potential growth or trend growth, which is also estimated with this approach. And we see the trend growth came down as well to varying degree in the 6 countries, which partially explains why natural interest rates declined. However, I already mentioned the downsides with this approach, and these are first that the uncertainty I already mentioned. Second, we work under the assumption of a closed economy. That's not very satisfactory because one often mentioned in the debate are capital flows as a driver for natural interest rates. And then another downside is that it doesn't really tell us why natural interest rates came down. I mean, it tells us the growth. However, we think of growth as an outcome and not as a primitive. So to fix one of these downsides, you see here on the right an extension of the Laubach and Williams approach developed by Wynn and Zhang, which basically introduces a second economy and works in an open economy framework and allows for international spillovers. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but I want to give you the main takeaways here from spillovers. So we find that there are counteracting forces. The counteracting forces are the following. So on the one hand, we had fast growth in emerging markets, which attracted investment from advanced economies, or the US in this case. So this led to capital leaving the US and raising the interest rate, natural interest rate. On the other hand, the fast growth in emerging markets led to a glut of savings, which were invested in safe assets in the US. So we had, on the other side, capital inflows into the US, putting downward pressure on the natural rate. And both forces kind of cancel each other out. Okay, so with this, I move on to the second downside of the previous approach, and that's the underlying drivers. So economists have put forward several explanations why natural interest rates change. And here I give you a list of many of them. So you might have heard of some of these. So there's a decline in TFP growth, demographic change, change in inequality, public debt is an important factor coming in, capital flows again. So here in this table, you see the implied impact on the natural rate, and let me explain a bit. So the conceptual framework, how to think, how these drivers affect the natural interest rate. Conceptual framework is that we have aggregate savings demand in the economy, aggregate savings supply, and the intersections of the curve give you the natural interest rate. Now, whatever moves these curves can have an effect on the natural interest rate. And the table shows how these drivers can affect both of these curves and the ultimate impact on the natural interest rate. Yeah. And maybe to give intuition, let me give more detail on the demographic driver. So what's going on? So on the one hand, you have a higher life expectancy, which leads, so households, they expect to live to be longer in retirement. So they accumulate more savings while they are still in the labor force. So this moves aggregate savings out and lowers the natural rate. On the other hand, population aging leads to more people in retirement. Now, people in retirement usually, they accumulated savings while they were working, but in retirement, they draw down their savings. So this force should move savings supply in the other direction and move natural interest rates up. So here you can already see that theoretically, it's not really clear what the ultimate impact will be. So, and for this reason, we need a model so that we can quantify the effect on the natural rate. So this brings me to the next slide. So we use a model that was developed by me and a co-author, where we integrate the drivers you saw in the previous page into one model. So I will not go into many details of the model. I think the most important features are overlapping generations. So economists are familiar with this term, overlapping generations model, with which we can model basically the aging population and how it affects the economy. And then second, heterogeneous agent, in particular intergenerational heterogeneity, which allows us to capture adequately inequality dynamics. And then we work in general equilibrium, so we'll also have a public sector and firms in this model. So the nice thing about this framework is that we can combine all the drivers you saw on the previous page in one model. And I think we do, so also when it comes to the calibration, I don't want to spend too much time. I think we do due diligence. So some of the inputs the data inputs that go into calibrating the model are population pyramids for that and how they develop over time. We match top 10 income shares, the change in the labor share, and many other variables. We calibrate this model to the 5 largest advanced economies and 3 largest emerging markets, which jointly cover about 70% of the world economy. And so with this, let's go to the results. What does this model tell us? So here we look at we decompose the change in the natural rate between the late 1970s and before the pandemic. You see here the 8 economies we look at. And the black dot shows the total change in the natural interest rate, which aligns up well with what we got from Laubach and Williams. But here I want to focus more, so the Laubach and Williams approach, but here I want to focus more on the individual drivers. So we see that for the advanced economies, main drivers are demographic change and TFP growth. So these are the blue and red bars. You see that demographic change comes in has a negative impact on natural interest rates for basically all 8 economies. And then we see, so here we again see international spillovers in green. We find the effect to be limited, but it goes in the expected direction. So United States, a negative effect, and in Japan, a positive effect, for example. Then when it comes to emerging markets, we see a more diverse picture. You see that TFP growth, the blue bar, is actually positive in some of these countries, which I think is intuitive. And for India, we even find a slight increase in the natural rate over this time period. You also see that the yellow bar is positive in all countries. So that's public policy. So that's public debt and tax policy. Then if you look, for example, at Japan, it's a huge counteracting force. So as you might know, public debt went up quite a lot over this time frame in Japan, which acted as a counteracting force for natural interest rates. Okay, and then there are some country-specific forces like inequality in the US. Now let's move to the outlook. So we use the same model to generate projections for the natural rate. So here the inputs are important. So and the inputs, so the assumptions briefly are for demographic projections we use the United Nations data. And for TFP growth, for advanced economies, we hold TFP growth constant. And for emerging markets, we assume a slow convergence to the advanced economy average. And then what we get is, for advanced economies, we get a stable outlook. And with the interest rates in a range around 0, with the United States actually the highest, at about 75 basis points. For emerging markets, you see the slow decline to advanced economy levels by 2050. And this is mostly driven by, so the number one driver here is demographic change. So the demographic transition still has to play out. So it's full effect on the natural rate in emerging markets, while in advanced economies, the biggest effect is already incorporated. And then part of it is also our assumption of declining TFP growth. Now, we can conceive plausible alternative scenarios for the future. So we're facing some important policy choices. And here in these alternative scenarios, we present 3. There are more in the chapter. So one of them is an further increase in public debt and an erosion of convenience yields of advanced economies. And under this assumption, we would expect natural rates to go up by 60 basis points relative to the baseline. Now, another important development is a transition to a net zero emissions economy. So that's the scenario in green. So you see one line for advanced economies and one for emerging markets. So the chapter goes into details how this transition, what's the impact on the natural rate. Let me just give you here our baseline finding, and that is that it will have a negative effect on natural rates, at least under this baseline scenario of a revenue neutral transition. If we have a big push, like a big stimulus for the transition and a lot of government spending, then we can temporarily have an increase in the natural rate. And you see a scenario like that in the chapter. And then we also have a geoeconomic fragmentation scenario with varying effects on countries. And here I also refer you to the chapter. Okay, so then I'm already at the last slide, and in the interest of time, I will just briefly go over the policy applications again. So for monetary policy, the implication is that the effective lower bound will likely become a constraint again for monetary policy, especially in times of recessions. And for fiscal policy, even though low interest rates, it sounds like it's beneficial for debt sustainability. However, we find that the same forces that push interest rates down also lead to lower growth, which is detrimental for debt dynamics. Yeah, and then in the chapter, we give you a quantification, so how much of a fiscal adjustment the countries need to stabilize their debt. And we find that there is a trade-off, not very surprising, that delaying the consolidation for longer will require a larger consolidation overall. Okay, with this, I leave it here and hand it over to Adrian.
Si quieres. Y para los números aquí.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be in Universidad de Los Andes and to have all these institutions interested in our work. So we'll be very much looking forward to our discussion. And well, this is the other chapter, chapter 3 of the analytical chapters of the World Economic Outlook. This is about how to tackle soaring public debt. Many authors, we all worked quite a bit, so I will skip that part. So the motivation for this chart can be easily shown by looking at this graph. If you look at the graph here and the black line, that is the debt to GDP. So the chapter will focus on the debt to GDP ratio. And what you see is that it's been basically going up. It jumped up during COVID-19, in part because of the GDP decline. It went down substantially over these recent periods because of the recovery, in part because of inflation as well. And the expectation, according to the World Economic Outlook, is that it will continue going up. It's interesting to see that this is exactly touching the 100% of world GDP. So it's just interesting to see those numbers. Of course, the average disguises the heterogeneity within. Specifically, the US and China have a path going up aggressively according to the expectations. So in light of these facts and expectations, we ask a few questions in the chapter. One is, well, for countries that have reduced debt, so debt is very high. Our motivation for the chapter is some countries may be interested in changing that a little bit and reducing it. And the objective really of the chapter is to provide some thinking into how to do it, how it has been done. So that's why we start first into the how has it been done. And we look at the contribution of different factors, including growth and inflation. Then in terms of approaches to deal with high public debts, we're going to look not only at the immediate effect of a policy change, but also with an emphasis on the medium to long term of fiscal consolidation and debt restructuring. Then we will see under what conditions those two approaches, and notice I say approaches, fiscal consolidation is certainly a policy. A country may choose to reduce its spending or increase its taxes. Restructuring is a different object altogether. Restructuring, first of all, is not a unilateral decision. For it to be restructuring, it requires the agreement on the other side of the creditors. Restructuring is extremely complicated, slow. It has important implications for countries that have to be considered, including exclusion from financial markets. So keep that in mind. And finally, I will try to draw some lessons for today. So right away, I can tell you more or less what we find, more or less, and then I'll show you how we find it. So first of all, when you look at how has it been done, you will see that when countries manage to reduce debt to GDP, in some sense, multiple factors are at play helping. So in advanced economies, surpluses play a role, but also growth, inflation less so. In emerging markets, growth and inflation are, relatively speaking, more important. So that's number one. Number two, and a key message of the chapter in terms of policy, fiscal consolidation, when adequately tailored, can reduce debt to GDP ratios. A few pointers into what does it mean adequately tailored. Done in good times, when debt is high already, or the private access to credit is already low. In advanced economies, more expenditure than revenue base, and we'll cover more details. What about restructuring? There we find that on average, the impact is strong and durable, especially if it's executed through face value reductions. By face value reductions, in case you are not familiar, it means that the creditor accepts to simply change the level of the debt. So it forgives a part of it, as opposed to restructuring with a reprofiling or other approaches where basically you keep the nominal amount the same, but they allow you to pay over a longer period. That's the other option. So face value reductions tend to be stronger. Of course, if there is coordination, that helps quite a bit. And a big lesson here, as you will see, is that it has to be deep. So there are cases of reductions or restructurings that are relatively small. They are very complicated and not very powerful at the end. I will come back to the lessons later, so let me just skip. So first, looking a bit to the past. So this is based on a very standard approach called debt decompositions. So this is just identities. There is no economics in here. But what is it doing is still useful. So what we do is, first of all, we have three groups of income of countries and economies. Number one. Number two, we look, this is fundamental. This chart only shows episodes where debt to GDP was going down. Those episodes tend to last between 5 to 7 years, depending the country, etc. And what you see, so the black dot is what was the per year reduction over such episodes, depending on the group of countries. So let's say -3 and some is the average really reduction that you observe in advanced economies when debt to GDP is falling. Okay, that's number one. Number two, the components. So these are identities. So basically that means that the bars, the pluses and the minus add up to the black. Okay. So the change in debt is is accounted for or comes from those places. So for example, what immediately captured your attention in the case of advanced economies is red. There you see that that is primary balance surpluses. So when debt is falling in advanced economies, that is playing a big role. Blue as well. Dark blue is real GDP growth. In contrast, you see that in emerging economies, the other blues are a bit bigger. And in low-income economies, the red is there, but it's not that prominent. So fiscal consolidation is not as important or have not been happening together with debt to GDP reductions in the past. So that's number one. Then we try to dig a bit deeper into more causal factors. Before I go there, let me point to you to a very interesting statistic that is extremely robust. So we say, what is the role of fiscal consolidation? So we go first straight into the policy actions that governments can take. So the left-hand side, there is no economics or econometrics, but it's nevertheless very interesting. What you will find, what we did there is to look at countries over time, and then we say, let me look in periods, years, when the country was consolidating, where primary surpluses were occurring. And then we say, okay, let's look at what was happening to debt to GDP one period after, because of how the effects of primary balance operate. And what we see is that it is as likely, broadly speaking, in median, in advanced economies to see that in a period where you're consolidating, nothing is happening to debt on average, which means that it's likely that it's going up as it is going down. So that is very interesting. And then we went and did much more econometric analysis because that at first sounded a bit puzzling. So we did all sorts of econometric approaches, taking into account the endogeneity of all the variables. So we did local projections. We used narrative information to try to take into account endogeneity. We did a structural vector autoregression analysis. All of them yield the same result. On average, fiscal consolidations do not reduce debt. On average. Of course, on average is very broad and perhaps not very useful. So the interesting part of the chapter in terms of analytics maybe starts here, where the question is, okay, so on average it doesn't work, but when it works, can we learn a bit of how come? Also maybe when it doesn't work, what's happening? So for that, we continued with the structural vector autoregression. This is very technical, so for those interested, you can listen. For those not, you can skip. The important part is here. So we use shocks, so this structural vector autoregression will split the drivers of debt into GDPs moving over time because things happen. Vis-a-vis, the country chooses to consolidate. And then there are cases we use the flexibility of the structural autoregression, vector autoregression to separate cases where you're consolidating and debt is moving in the opposite direction, as opposed to fiscal surplus and debt moving in the same direction. So we say, how does that occur? The advantage of the S-bar is that you can look at all of the variables, so you can take a look to the economy and what's happening. So what's here? This is what people call the input responses to, here I'm only showing you how economy reacts when fiscal consolidation is occurring. And what you see here, one of the lessons in the interest of time, I cannot explain all of the graphs, but one of them is blue is going to be the case when primary balance is increasing and debt is going down. Red is the case, is how the economy reacts when primary balance is increasing, so surplus, and debt is actually increasing. And here you see how the variables behave. So let me point to one, the report goes deeper into others. Let me point to one that is of interest. First of all, the shock that we're considering is 1%. So this is kind of a normalization. So you can think for each 1% consolidation, what is the impact that we choose? And what you see is, well, as I promised, or as we said, in one case, debt is going up, in one case, debt is going down, and our numbers there, these percentage points of GDP. But in terms of how is that operating, what you see is the one distinguishing factor between the two is that the impact of a 1% increase of consolidation into GDP, what people call sometimes a multiplier, is much smaller in the case when you manage to reduce debt. And there is a whole literature, this aspect, on how come, what can you do so that the multiplier is not so big or is big. Number one. Number two, so we went also deeper and said, okay, let's try to relate it to other conditions that may be of interest to a policymaker, to the context. So what is this chart? This chart is telling you the baseline probability that you consolidate and debt goes down is about 50%, as I mentioned. Now that probability changes as certain factors change. That's what you have here. So, for an example, when you have your economy, so the domestic output gap, think about how the economy is going. Is it in an expansion? Is it in a recession? So when you do fiscal consolidation and you are in an expansion, the probability that debt is reduced increases 6 percentage points. So you go from 50 to almost 60. And when that is in combination with not only you, but the world economy also expanded, then you go to 70 plus. So the probability of reducing debt when consolidation is affected by the conditions of the economy. In those ways, we quantify that. Other factors relate to the participation of credit. So if debt to GDP, public debt, remember all of this is about public debt. Public debt to GDP is high, that means that there is a lot of crowding out because the government is capturing a lot of the resources in the financial system. So when you reduce that even a little bit, it's beneficial because you free up resources for the private sector. Very good. So that's part number one. So you can consolidate how to improve the chances of consolidation. This is the summary, if you wish. Then we go part number two, the more a bit more radical approach, which is debt restructuring and its effects. First of all, since the literature on fiscal consolidation multipliers is really huge, we haven't seen papers that study the impact on debt reduction. So that was new. But the literature on restructuring is a bit less well-known, perhaps. So we start more basic here. And here we look at the different types of restructuring, the different timing, how it works, just the data. How frequent has it been done by the different ways? So, for example, we see most of the restructurings that have occurred happen not in the way I first mentioned, not through face value reduction, but rather through cash flow relief. Cash flow relief is when the creditor tells you, okay, you owe me the same, but you have 5 more years to pay me the same amount. That's an example of that. Also happen preemptively. What does that mean? That they happen before the countries actually start not making payments to their debt. And finally, they have happened mostly through Paris Club arrangements. So with some cooperation across different countries. Number two, as I mentioned, restructuring is complicated. So what you see here is 0 is the episode of consolidation, sorry, restructuring. And then we ask what was happening 3, 2, 1 years before. And what you see is happening is that the fraction of countries that were undertaking fiscal consolidation increases. The message here is countries are trying to reduce their debt, and they are trying, perhaps, this is a conjecture, but maybe they are trying to avoid restructuring until it doesn't work, and then they have to go that way. In the interest of time, I'll skip this and go to the analytics. The previous was, again, a debt decomposition, but looking at restructuring. Since it's only descriptive, I go into analytics. So here what we do is, again, we try to use a lot of econometrics, and since this is a university, I'll be delighted to discuss to any degree that you want, the technicalities behind it. But the result, if you allow me to do that first, is we take into account, again, try to control for the endogeneity aspects of restructuring. Restructuring doesn't happen in the vacuum. So we try here to give the effect of the particular thing or of isolating the pure impact of debt restructuring. What you see is, number one, it goes down. So on average, the effect is negative. So debt to GDP is reduced. Number two, the numbers are large. So the effect is relatively big. Especially, so what is the distinction? White two bars, red and blue. Red is when you do restructuring together with fiscal consolidation. Okay, so large, sustained, particularly large when fiscal consolidation is also taking place. So that's the basic analytics. Similarly, if it's, for example, we have a one-off, which is this HIPIC, and some coordinated worldwide efforts to help poor countries reduce their debts. And yes, those were extremely powerful. Similarly, when you do face value reduction, so the restructurings that are done through face value reduction, not surprisingly, are very big on impact. This is almost a tautology, right? Because I'm telling you, I forgive you that, it has to go on. But still, the magnitude is not a tautology, so that's interesting. There's only so much you can do with econometrics. So the great advantage we have in the IMF is that we have country teams that work with countries directly, that know the countries well, and then we went and asked them a little bit of, tell us in a country where restructuring was happening, how did you do it, what helped, what other lessons are important. So we did a bit of that, and this is gonna be almost the end. And what you see is what we have a few case studies, so I invite you to take a look. But I want to highlight a few items. So what you have here is the case studies, and then I go back to the basics. This is just the debt decomposition across the country. So what you see in cases that very successfully reduce debt, pay attention, for example, to Seychelles or Jamaica. Number one, the magnitudes. This is not a mistake, I triple check, because when you see something going down more than 100%, you're a bit surprised. So yes, they reduce their debt to GDP more than 100 percentage points of GDP. Of course, the starting position was very high. Main policy lesson that is important to look in here is that all bars are kind of going in the direction that you wish. Not the yellow, because that one by construction, the interest rate is positive, so that can never go negative in some sense. This is the nominal interest expense. So you see that they consolidated, and this is the cumulative impact on the debt to GDP reduction over this period. So they consolidated quite a bit. Inflation played a role. Everything was going in their favor. In fact, you see that this restructuring is there, but it's not the most important driver. So you can restructure, but to make it sustain, big, etc., you need to consolidate. As opposed to countries here on the right, like Belize or Mozambique, where you do not see the red, and some of them, in fact, red is consolidation. By the way, in those countries, they did multiple rounds of restructuring, and as you can see, the effect on debt to GDP is not worth it in some sense. Restructuring is complicated with no effect. To conclude, the policy lessons is for countries that can afford to do a moderate pace of reduction of debt to GDP. So if you're not in the middle of a crisis, and if you want to reduce debt to GDP, then what you should be doing is, well, to do fiscal consolidation. Ideally, so one of the important lessons of the analysis is countercyclical fiscal policy is important. So if you're expanding, you should be, and you care about debt to GDP, potentially you should be reducing your debt. If external conditions are favorable, then even more so. In terms of when you go beyond that, when you cannot afford to do a small reduction, when you are already under debt distress and go the debt restructuring way, if you are going to have to go there, it's better to consider it from the beginning. It's very costly to do back and forth and think about it and not do it fully. Do it quickly, do it fast, do it coordinated. Typically, we have found that when it's done through policy packages, including the IMF, that allows this comprehensive approach, it works better. Creditor coordination is necessary to make it fast. Of course, and here since we have people from the fiscal rules thinking, you will see that this part is crucial. Durable debt ratio reductions rely or hinge on strong institutional frameworks. which include fiscal rules that are actually respected. It's not only having them, but actually using them. For example, also to ensure that good times translate into debt reduction, so countercyclical fiscal policy. And with that, I stop to give time to my colleague. Thank you so much, and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, now I'm going to present the final chapter, chapter 4, about geo-economic fragmentation and foreign direct investment. Sitting in here, and also those who are joining online. So let me begin with this globalization chart on the left. So this shows that there has been a slowdown in globalization that has started at least since the global financial crisis in 2007 and 9. And as you can see in blue solid line, there has been a slowdown in trade, world trade, and also in red, it shows a slowdown in global FDI flows. And the reason why we were motivated by this globalization chart, which is nothing new now, is because given the recent pandemic and supply chain disruptions and also rising geopolitical risks, such as US-China trade war or Russian invasion of Ukraine, they are all making it increasingly more likely that deglobalization is like to continue over time from now on, and also there is going to be more accelerated. And that is also can be seen from the chart on the right-hand side. And there you can see the blue dashed line spiking up recently, marking the record high levels. And that is a measure of geopolitical risk index. So geopolitical risk index in the global world has been marking the record high levels. At the same time, what you can observe from that chart is a spike in and surge in red solid line. And that is our own measure of interest in reshoring by global firms, which is basically the application of the text mining analysis on the earning course data from the global firms, and how many and how frequently these firms are mentioning reshoring, onshoring, or friendshoring, something like that. And as you can see that there's been a very modest increase, and then since US-China trade war, it has been increasing, and then recent pandemics, and then Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have seen the very rapid surge in the firms' interest in offshorings, onshorings, and reshorings going on. So against this background, what we are going to do in this chapter is try to understand potential economic costs of geo-economic fragmentation going forward, and with a particular focus on foreign direct investment fragmentation. And the reason why we are focusing on FDI in particular in this chapter is because, first of all, we know that there is a very strong association between FDI flows and economic growth. So FDI has been a very important engine for economic growth for emerging market and developing economies. So going forward, if there is going to be a FDI fragmentation risk and slowdown in FDI flows to emerging market economies, then it's going to be very costly for their economic growth. That's the one reason why. And also second reason why is because those firms who are doing FDIs, so they are the multinational firms, and also those who are interested in reshoring going forward, they tend to be on average bigger and larger and more productive firms. So if they are going to shrink their own business activities, that is going to have some big implications for economic global economy. And lastly, we know that especially for emerging market economies, again, the FDI explains a non-negligible part of overall capital in both countries. So with lower flows in FDI, then there is going to be lower and lower accumulation of capital in those countries, which will have, again, adverse implications. So that's why we are interested in understanding those potential impact. So in this chapter, we basically do 5 separate but interrelated exercises. First, we try to check out some stylized effect and whether there are any early signs of FDI fragmentation already going on. And second, we also try to show you that geopolitical distance matters for FDI flows, not just the geographical distance, but also geopolitical distance. And third, given the economic structure of the countries that we have right now, we are trying to assess which countries and industry are likely to be more vulnerable to potential fragmentation risk. And then we also provide some empirical evidence about the specific channels through which FDI affect countries' economic growth. And then lastly, we are going to show you some simulation of the DSG kind of model that quantifies potential economic costs of FDI fragmentation. Okay, so first, this is the stylized effect. And we checked out FDI flows between countries around the world and over time, and particular focus on greenfield FDI. And the left-hand side heat map chart shows that how which kind of FDI flows between host and source countries has been increasing recent years relative to previous pre-pandemic years. And green blocks shows that there has been a relative increase in recent period relative to pre-pandemic period, and red maps are the ones that has been showing decline in recent period relative to pre-pandemic period. And there, most of the red squares tends to be located for China as of both host countries and source countries. So what it basically suggests is that most of the FDI flows from US and Western countries into China has been decreasing in recent years compared to pre-pandemic period. And also the FDI flows from China to many Western countries, including US, has been decreasing recently relative to pre-pandemic period. But that was not the case for many other partner countries. And also, if we zoom in onto the US FDI flows on the right-hand side chart, we can see that there has been also the geographical distribution, and some of the countries received more FDI from US in recent period compared to the previous period, whereas some other countries received less FDI from US in recent period compared to the pre-pandemic period. And if you look at the countries alongside there, then we can see that Costa Rica and Colombia, India, Canada, Korea has been receiving more FDI from US in recent period, whereas China, Hong Kong, and Vietnam, for example, they were receiving less FDI from US in recent period. So there you can get a sense of some of the geopolitical distance between US and other host countries might be playing a role there. So that is just a simple stylized effect. So next we perform a little bit more formal analysis to understand the important role of geopolitical distance between countries. So we use United Nations General Assembly voting data, and we check out how countries, how similarly the countries' pairs are voting in United Nations and how different they are voting. And given the similarity and the dissimilarities between these two countries, we can construct geopolitical distance between country A and B. Okay, so that will be our measure of geopolitical distance between host and source countries. And we also check out to compare it to more traditional geographical distance. We use standard gravity variables. And the chart on the left shows two important findings. First one is the fact that blue solid line lies above the red solid lines. And blue solid line turns out to be the role of geopolitical distance, and red solid line is a role of geographical distance. So that means that geopolitical distance matters more than geographical distance for bilateral FDI flows. Okay, and the second fact from there is that the gap between blue and red solid line has been increasing over time. And it has been the big time in recent period that shows that geopolitical distance is becoming more and more important for bilateral FDI flows compared to the role of geographical distance. So that's what the chart illustrates. And if we just focus on geopolitical distance now, then which has been increasingly more important, then we can also check it out by sectors. And it turns out that the role of geopolitical distance has been becoming more important for particularly the strategic sectors, which include pharmaceutical or semiconductors and something like those kinds of R&D intensive sectors compared to all other sectors. So that is also consistent with the idea that potential FDI fragmentation risks due to geo-economic fragmentation is going to be more relevant for strategic FDI sectors. Okay, so given these ideas and findings, then we can ask, then which countries and industries are likely to be more vulnerable to potential geo-economic fragmentation risk? And for that, we combine three different dimensions of the considerations. First one, we consider geopolitical aspect, and second, we consider market power aspect, and third, we consider the strategic sector aspect. So the idea is that if a country tends to have an FDI received relatively more from geopolitically distant countries, then that country will be relatively more exposed to potential FDI fragmentation risk. That's the idea, and we are going to measure it given the current FDI structure of the economy. And second one, market power consideration, is that all else being equal, if a country has a relatively strong market power in a certain sector, then that country will be less vulnerable to potential FDI fragmentation risk because the source countries will have less incentive to leave their countries whose market power is relatively strong in that sector. Okay. And about the strategic sector consideration, if a country tends to have more FDI received in strategic sectors like pharmaceuticals or semiconductor industry, then we can think of that country tends to be more vulnerable to potential fragmentation risks. So that was the idea. We could construct each one of them, and then we can combine all these three different separate indices together and aggregate them out. And we can see that if we compare advanced economy groups and emerging market economies groups, then vulnerability tends to be much higher for emerging market economies. And if we just compare it through regional groupings, then we can see that sub-Saharan African countries and Asian Pacific countries, and as well as some Middle East countries, they tend to be relatively higher than Latin American or European countries. So they are some suggestive chart about the potential vulnerability to fragmentation risks. And now we also have some empirical evidence about how FDI affects host countries' economic growth. And here we basically perform some simple growth regressions of economic growth on FDI to GDP ratio. So whether those countries with relatively higher FDI tends to be growing faster. So that was kind of this very simple growth with cross-country growth regressions. But one thing that we did it differently from the previous studies in the literature is that we try to distinguish different types of FDI, vertical FDI from horizontal FDI. So horizontal FDI is a typical case when the foreign firms enters the host country with a purpose to serve that country directly. the local market, whereas vertical FDI is rather for foreign firms entering the country to produce some intermediate input that will be in turn supplied to these headquarter firms in the foreign country. So that is the idea. And given that vertical FDI tends to embody more advanced technologies in this intermediate input processing, so the vertical FDI may be more relevant for the positive spillovers to the host countries compared to the horizontal FDI case, and we found exactly that. So in that, it is mostly vertical FDI that has a positive effect on host countries' economic growth, and for horizontal FDI, it is either negative or positive, but they are all statistically insignificant. And even for this vertical FDI effect, it turns out that the effect is mostly found in emerging markets and developing economies. Okay, so that's the idea. Then, given these findings and facts and motivated by this stuff, then we could construct a multi-country DSG type of model to quantify potential costs of FDI fragmentation going forward. And here in this model framework, we perform several interesting exercises, but the rule of the game was such that we grouped all the countries in the world into eight groups. So first, United States as alone, and China second, and then European countries as a whole, and then all other advanced economies like Japan and South Korea. And then we have India and Indonesia as one group, and other Southeast Asian countries, and then Latin American countries, and then rest of the world. Then, based on granular information, UN General Assembly's voting patterns, we try to map each one of these groups to US groups or China groups, based on whether their voting patterns tends to be closer to US or China. So we ended up with, in the baseline scenario, United States and Europe and other advanced economies are all grouped as a US-friendly group, whereas China and other Southeast Asian countries and rest of the world are grouped as a China-friendly groups. And then we have India and Indonesia as one, and then Latin American countries as an in-between. So they are not aligned either to US or to China, okay? So that's our framework. And then our exercise for simulation is what's going to happen if we raise investment barriers between these US and China bloc countries, okay? In such a way that there will be a sudden decline in investment flows between US bloc countries and China bloc countries. But nothing will happen to these non-aligned in-between countries. Then overall result can be summarized in this chart. So black dot shows the medium-term effect in 5 years, and overall bar shows the long-run effect. So in the case of world here as a whole, the global world will end up with -2% of GDP losses. So we will live in a poorer world by 2% of GDP as a result of our model simulations due to these heightened investment barriers. And in the medium term, it was a little bit lower than that, but it has been accumulating over time. And then we can also check it out that how that can be coming from. So some kind of decomposition, and blue solid one shows that it is because of lower investment leads to lower capital accumulation. It will have a direct implications on economic growth. That is that direct capital accumulation channel. And then there's a green bar there, which is a labor productivity spillover channels. So with lower FDI flows, then there will be lower spillover to labor productivity growth. And there's going to be a second round channels, which tends to be concentrated in China bloc countries because they are mostly developing countries that benefit from spillovers from advanced economies FDI, but that is not common in US bloc countries. And another thing that you can notice is that overall economic losses from this FDI fragmentation is greater for China bloc countries than US bloc countries. And that is simply because the China bloc countries tend to receive more FDI from US bloc countries right now than US bloc countries receiving FDI from China bloc countries. Okay, so that's basically our model simulation result, giving an idea of the economic implication. So policy implication is very straightforward, that given that there is going to be a significant economic losses, we should try our best to preserve a multilateral dialogue to avoid further escalation in FDI fragmentation. But if we cannot avoid further FDI fragmentation, then still we will need to develop a framework for international consultations to minimize overall risks. And for individual countries, they will have to try hard to promote private sector development or undertaking some structural reforms to make their own countries to be as attractive as possible for potential FDI source countries. Okay, thank you very much. So this is it for chapter 4. Now we will have a discussion session. Okay, good.
Thank you very much for being here. It is an honor for me to be commenting on this outlook. I really enjoyed reading it, and I invite everyone who's here online and present to read it. I think the conclusions are very interesting. The methodology is incredible. I loved your SVAR regression. I hadn't seen it before, so thank you very much. I will be commenting on chapter 3 about a debt GDP ratio. I believe we are in a moment where obviously after the pandemic, we have very high rates of national debt. And that is not only in Colombia, and I will try to comment on Colombia, but it is around the world. In fact, I think Colombia is around, Fernando was telling me, more or less 60% or a little less in Colombia. And so if you see the 100 line, we are under that ratio. And I think that, for example, in the 80s, we had a similar situation, but the context is absolutely different from what we have today. So what we did before is not really valid in what we're doing today. Colombia's situation is similar to more than 50% of the countries in the world today. And what is the context? And you said it already, we have a high debt ratio, but we have it with high interest rates, with growth reduction, with very strong dollar in the case of Colombia, and with high inflation, which in the case of this country is very, very important because it is like the priority at this moment more than growth or whatever other macroeconomic variable. So I was remembering the high interest rates because we were in the pandemic, and one of the persons that I admire most in economics, he said, it doesn't matter if we get indebted, we are in 1% interest rates, and now we are in about 13% of the central bank interest rates, and of course, that makes a huge difference in what the debt was before and the debt is today. In terms of growth reduction, Adrian, sorry, we are in growth reduction, but we have come from 2 years of exceptionally high increases in growth. 2021 and 2022, I understand 2021 because it was right after the pandemic, but 2022 is really growth that we didn't see in most countries, not only in Latin America, but the world. We came from 11% and 7% respectively. So if we manage to grow, even if it's 1% this year, it will be on a very high base. So that growth reduction is really not that bad in the case of Colombia. In terms of the strong dollar, I think it is very high. It is 25% higher than it was 2 years ago. And it's coming down, I think, for external reasons more than internal reasons. But that is a very important thing that also has an impact on what I said before about high inflation. High inflation in Colombia is now, as I said before, prior objective of macroeconomic, and it hasn't come down. I mean, until now, it's beginning to come down. I think that most economists in Colombia cannot answer exactly why it isn't coming down. I mean, food inflation is very high. It's about 28%. It's coming down a little. And what we are expecting is that at the end of the year, we will have a lower inflation, but it is still very, very high. And so I will talk about the findings that you mentioned that I think were very important, but as always, you have to see the difference between countries and between times. In terms of fiscal adjustments, you mentioned, and I love that you did, that fiscal adjustments were very important and had a good impact if they come with growth enhancing reforms and with strong institutional frameworks. And that is true because, for example, in fiscal restraints, we have, in fiscal adjustments, we have some problems. In Colombia, it is absolutely clear that the inflexibility is absolutely horrific. You say that? I don't know. But it's very difficult to get down expenditures for many reasons. There are expenditures that are tied to laws. There are demands that you don't know. So getting expenditures down is very difficult. Getting taxes up. I was just going to tell you that I was the CEO of a company for 18 years now, and all the investors, they used to tell me, I am in the radio every morning, the 1st of January, because we know there's going to be a tax reform, and that is true. So it is very difficult at this moment to make a tax increase because of social turmoils, but also because after all this tax reform, what we would have maybe is less investment and growth due to more than what we want taxes. And the other thing is the dependency on non-permanent revenues, as is the case of oil in Colombia. So not only if we do have or not have oil in the future, but also the instability of prices of oil. So those things are very difficult to manage, and fiscal adjustments per se will not make a difference. So let's talk about what I more want to emphasize today, and it's the institutional framework. And I do want to emphasize this because I think that one of the most important institutions in Colombia at this moment is the fiscal rule. We talked about it and you said we have to enhance this fiscal rule, and we do. We are here, many of the people present today as part of this commission. And I think that having targets and being very strict about them will be the key to be able to reduce public ratios. And beforehand, I don't know if you know that, but we had a fiscal rule, but it was a fiscal rule that did not have an anchor for debt. And now it has an anchor for debt as of 2022. And that is absolutely important as to this debt ratio. This tool can be a useful instrument. It relates the structural primary balance to the net debt, generating superavits whenever the current debt level is above an anchor, and adjusting the fiscal space according to the economic and oil cycle. So I think this is one of the most important things in the case of Colombia. In terms of growth enhancing reforms that are aimed at increasing supply capabilities, it is very crucial. And only when it is aimed at increasing supply capabilities, because in Colombia, we still have to work on making the real GDP less than the potential GDP, because otherwise it will have more pressure on inflation, and that is the case today. So structural reforms, improving productivity are key to increase growth and decrease the debt as GDP ratio. But that, because if you don't do that, then you will not be achieving what you want. The second of the recommendations was about debt restructuring. As I said, we have around 60% or less than 60% of this debt. This is something that we have done for many years. I don't believe the face value. We have been working on the timing, we have been working on the conditions, the responsible in Colombia, and doing this as a national debt office, as you know, it is in the Ministry of Finance. And it is permanently seeking not only better conditions as rates, deferrals, etc., but also looking for different and not as costly credit sources as multilaterals instead of commercials. Also, we have been changing external debt for local debt, which minimizes the risks when currency rates go up, as in this case. And I mean, you made a lot of importance about the image of the country and of the future lending of the capital market, but this kind of restructuring really do not affect Colombia in that case, so that should be done. And I loved it, like the statistics around how we do it. I don't know exactly, and I have to ask you afterwards the cases to see what the difference are. So I think that those are my comments. Thank you very much, and I really enjoyed the report. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming here. Well, that long trip and presenting this. I was delighted to read all the report. It's very, very useful for the time now. So I'm gonna make some comments on it. I'm gonna start with what Sylvia was saying about the potential GDP. This is a super important tool for policy, but both for monetary policy and for fiscal policy. We usually use it for monetary policy. So we try to find that long-run interest rate or that natural interest rate to guide us how to do the monetary policy. So we try to find the potential GDP with this natural interest rate, and then if the interest rate set by the central bank it's above that one, then it's as if we are doing contractionary monetary policy. So we want to cool off the economy. And if it is below, then we want to give an impulse to the economy. Well, it turns out that fiscal policy also works like that, but we don't use potential GDP for those fiscal responses. And we should do that also. And that's a forthcoming work that we are doing at the committee. And it's how to guide fiscal policy also using a potential GDP. But of course, that potential GDP needs to have another dimension. We not only care about inflation, which is the main objective of the monetary authority, but we should also care about the cost of debt. So if the cost of debt is too high, maybe we should push back the fiscal policy. And if the cost of debt is below the growth of the economy, which is a condition for sustainability, as Joseph was saying, then we could do a higher response, right? So we're working on a measure of potential GDP that takes into account not only inflation but also the cost of debt. So we have this another dimension to guide fiscal policy, because fiscal policy also causes inflation, yes, but also we should care about the cost of debt. So, for example, Colombia was having a huge fiscal impulse, also a huge monetary impulse, and that is what probably led us to grow much more in 2021 and 2022, as Sylvia was saying. But then when we try to control inflation, increasing the interest rate, but fiscal policy was still expansive, right? Was still giving impulses to the economy. And so that's a difficult thing about policy, and it's which one is passive, which one is active. It seems fiscal policy is more active than monetary policy. And so monetary policy has to trail after the fiscal policy. So if fiscal policy is pushing the economy, is giving an impulse to the economy, but maybe too much, then we have to call it off, increasing interest rate. So that coordination is difficult. And it's probably because we don't have a measure for the potential GDP that takes into account those costs of the fiscal policy. So consider a case where we are using a potential GDP that takes into account inflation, but also the cost of debt. If we use that, maybe the result was don't do such a big fiscal impulse in 2022, because there was a super high cost of debt for Colombia. So if we are using more expenditure, well, it will cost much more in the future, and it will take a big part of our budget, and that's very costly. So this is like kind of a suggestion that we are working on. This is work in progress, but we think it should change the paradigm of how to use fiscal policy in a similar manner as we are using monetary policy. Of course, targeting that natural interest rate that Joseph was talking about is difficult. Why? Because you have inflation expectations. You have to target the nominal interest rate, but you have inflation expectations, and you are also having an active fiscal policy. So targeting that is very difficult, and that's why we should coordinate much more between fiscal and monetary policy. So this is about basically in the short run. What happens in the long run? In the long run, well, that's the importance of the structural reforms that you were highlighting. Structural reforms that enhance productivity. Which reforms, for example? Some reforms that encourage, for example, formality, which is very important in our countries. We have a huge chunk of informality. And part of the long-run problem of productivity is that big informality. So we should push for reforms encouraging formality, reducing distortions of firms. What Sylvia was saying, we have a tax reform every 2 years, and that causes a lot of distortions. It's very difficult to plan ahead for the firms. So that uncertainty, that tax uncertainty is creating uncertainty, and that is reducing investment, and that's reducing the long run growth. We need to increase R&D. We need more trade, as JaeBin was suggesting. We don't need the globalization. We need to continue having international trade. It's important for innovation and for adoption. And after the pandemic, we are observing the opposite, as JaeBin was showing us. And that's important for long run growth, and that is important for debt, but it's also very important to target this long run interest rate. Now, these policies that we were talking about monetary policy, fiscal policy, those are to ease the cycles, the economic cycles. But those target usually the demand, the aggregate demand. We should also think on targeting the supply, because that's the problem. We are having a crisis, for example, the pandemic or the international, the trade chains, the global chains of production. And that's a supply problem. And what's our solution? If the supply shrinks, then we also shrink the demand, so we don't cause inflation. Well, that's very costly. We should push the supply back to the previous levels. I mean, I understand that the tools we have right now, the tools that we know better, is to shrink the demand so we stop inflation. But we should also think on instruments to push the demand back to the previous levels so we don't have to hurt that much the demand. And that's very important for the interest rate. That's also very important to growth and decrease the debt levels. Well, I think those are basically my comments. So we want to invite you now for this quick round of questions from the public. If you have some, I don't know if you have some in YouTube. Here in the 5 shares, and Sylvia, please join us.
I was wondering about the normative implication of the ratio of debt to GDP. We see that the fiscal consolidation of many countries does not imply a reduction of this index. So and we work with this index in the fiscal rule committees, in all the analysis. So it is possible that this index is not the right index in all the context and all the historical periods. Perhaps it's better to make a combination of indicators like the ratio of debt to tax income and several other indicators.
Okay, thank you very much. No, that is of course an excellent question, and one that is considered deeply at the institution. The chapter, first of all, what the chapter says and doesn't say, the chapter does not take a view on what's the correct level of debt to GDP, number one. But of course, that is a very interesting question, and I can comment 2 things. One is there is some data that when debt is very high, the probabilities of debt crisis, self-fulfilling negative equilibrium occur more frequently. But what is too high, of course? So then that is a very difficult question, and I think the institution, even our sustainability analysis, are moving more towards a risk-based approach and a multi-dimensional approach. So if you look at the debt sustainability analysis at the fund, the methodology just changed, and it takes into account the multiplicity of factors, some of them including the cost of debt that were being mentioned before. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation. Great presentation. I have, well, taking advantage that we're a relatively small crowd, I will I would like to ask a question for each chapter. Sorry if I'm abusing the time of Q&A. The first question is for, and I will do it in the order it was presented. It was for me, it wasn't clear why the energy transition lowers the natural rate of interest. I think that you might argue that going from one technology to another different type of technology would create uncertainty, and coming around that transition, perhaps even taking the fiscal side neutral, you could have a positive change or increase. So I see forces coming in opposite directions. So that's more like a clarifying question, because it was very interesting. Second, about the fiscal, which perhaps is one of the topics that, given that CARF is hosting this, is more relevant. I will say first a comment is like that I wrote it somewhere here, is that sometimes when you follow countries like Colombia, it's interesting because you never have good times. There are always bad times. In the sense that even if you're growing at relatively good pace, you tend to have some sort of persistent on your expectations. So after a while, you think that you're going to be growing at 6%. So I remember times in when the fiscal group was created, Colombia was growing relatively close to 5-6%, and we were thinking that potential GDP growth was about that rate. So it was never a good time to save. Last year, we grew 7.5%, but if you ask any politician, it was not really a good time. So this is my comment is exposed is difficult. Is easy to spot that those were good times, but in real time is sometimes difficult. And well, and some of the comments of Andrés thinking on how to broaden the tools to think about good times versus bad times. But here's the question: is I was very surprised by the fact that when you think about the variables that change probability of successful outcomes, international variables play such a huge role. For instance, the world output gap was even more important than the domestic output gap. So in a way, is you coming here should be much more relevant to Colombia, because in a way, when you produce estimates of world output gap, that in a principle should guide us a lot about how to conduct domestic policy. So my question is how to reconcile this type of international versus domestic, and how to think about really what good times mean, and ex ante or at the same time how to implement those policies that, as I said, in my experience are challenging. And the third one is more about a curiosity. I think it was a great chapter. I read it before, so congratulations on great presentation. My only question is, it seems like going forward is very clear, but sometimes in my mind, determining how FDI's flows are determined is quite hard. Even and we were commenting, geopolitical comes with you could be embedded that you have the same language, or the same legal judicial system. So of course it's going to be more easy to invest in similar countries. So the question is more a curiosity. If you take your model and you simulate what we should already experience, which is a globalization, in a way that you lower the barrier and the US start investing in China, even if it might be political different, but because of low wages or whatever reason it was, if you get a proper sense of what already happened with FDI. So it's a kind of how you test that your model is relatively robust to this pattern, which is hard to, I guess, replicate. But that's it. Sorry about all those questions.
Maybe I jump in to set a couple of more questions there. What happened with the explanation of the differential of interest rates in the classical model, or in the New Keynesian approach in the short run? given the results that you get from the globalization issues, and I was wondering about the non-orthogonality of geopolitically facts and geographically distribution of countries. So, but if you only have time to answer one of my questions, I would wonder what happened with the differential interest rates and the push factors and the pull factors, and how does the paper it's inbuilt in the more classical way of understanding FDI. And I completely agree with Andres about the comments on broadening the model of understanding fiscal policy. Why don't we why don't we start thinking about nominal anchors for the fiscal policy? Why don't we start broadening as we did with the Keynesian approach for the monetary policy back in the 70s and the 80s, and then we have this inflation targeted revolution? Why don't we start thinking about, okay, is it I don't know, for example, a relative measure of spread that we can use to know where we need to harden our fiscal policy or lose the fiscal policy, given the credibility that the lenders are showing us to our countries through those variables of and drop a little bit those intermediate stock variables to GDP, like we did in the monetary policy. I remember when I was young, we were following M3 to GDP as a measure of successful monetary policy indicator. Now maybe it's time to start dropping out GDP debt to GDP ratios and start looking at nominal anchors. But of course, those ideas coming from a really indebted country in Latin America might be not as listened as if it would come from the monetary policy authority of the world. And I really wanted to see if we had some questions from the listeners abroad.
Okay, let me start with the question on energy transition and our star. So in the chapter, you see a decomposition of the various effects. So we take into account effects of taxation on our star, even avoided damages because of reduction or moving to a net zero economy. The main intuition why, at least over the longer run, you see a decline in our star is that energy prices are assumed to go up, and capital and energy are complements in production. So higher energy will lead to less capital used in production, which lowers R star. So that's the intuition there. But yeah, and but important to keep in mind is that we have two scenarios there, and you can also see in the chapter. So we have a scenario where with a fiscal expansion, so to say, to push the transition, interest rates will temporarily go up.
We see chapter 2, 3, and 4. So okay, so the first point about the chapter 4 had actually two elements in the questions. And first one is it is not clear how FDI will evolve going forward, right? So in our analysis and in our simulation, we had a very stylized one particular scenario, which is very simple enough, but in the real world, it's much more complicated than that, right? And we don't know exactly whether it's going to be even worse or less worse, or not even sure about it. And you can see from the US policy development, like for example, Inflation Reduction Act, they are talking about some subsidies for for battery industries, but they are not even clear whether it's going to be only for domestic companies or foreign companies producing in US or Mexico. Nothing is clear. So that involves a lot of uncertainties. So right now, even for now, we have a lot of uncertainties around there. But our understanding is that uncertainty itself is as bad as FDI fragmentation in practice, because we know that with growing uncertainties about these policies going on, then investors will tend to wait and see what's going to happen, which will reduce investment itself. So it already has some level effect. So in that sense, we don't know exactly how it's going to evolve, but our understanding is that uncertainty right now is already having adverse effect on the overall global FDI flows. And then your next point was, how about disciplining our model framework, not just for what's going to happen in the future, but based on what we have had before, then it may be interesting to see how FDI played a role. And this model may be useful to quantify the effect. And I truly agree with you. And this is not something we did here in the chapter, but this is something that we may want to expand to or go beyond. So thank you very much for the suggestions. And as for the some of the push and pull factors, how they are affecting the overall global FDI flows, that's also a very good point, and we are aware of the importance of these push and pull factors. But in our regulations, for example, the gravity type of regulations for bilateral flows, we just controlled for these push and pull factors with host country year fixed effect and source country year fixed effect. So in that sense, we just address those effects and rather than exploring those dimensions. So that is something that we may want to further understand better, rather than just controlling for it. Okay, and about the differential interest rate, how it's going to be affecting, and this is also a very valid point. But for our framework, the FDI is a little bit less sensitive to differential interest rate or interest rate differential than other types of financial flows. And in that sense, our monetary and capital markets department, they also have flagship report about global financial stability report, which is corresponding one to our WIO project. And they had one chapter about all global financial flows and fragmentation. In our chapter, we focused on FDIs. And in their chapter, they focused on all the financial flows other than FDI flows. So that may be something that might interest you further. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, I started too fast in the previous questions. I'm sure on behalf of all of us to thank you for the excellent discussions. And maybe since time is eroding, I heard general questions of the importance of growth, the importance of institutions, coming from the discussants and from the audience. So maybe let me touch on that, because we studied in the chapter indeed the drivers of debt to GDP, and I did not emphasize it in the presentation, but one of the most robust findings we have is that fluctuations in debt to GDP are a crucial driver of debt to GDP, fluctuations in GDP itself. So growth, as it goes up, as it goes down, that is a very important driver of GDP. So it touches on some of the discussion here of, but it's not automatic, right? So you see on average, and this also relates to points made by many of you, that we do observe that as GDP goes up, on average, countries tend to consolidate. As GDP goes down, on average, countries tend to go into deficits. So on average, countries tend to practice what looks like a Taylor rule, if you wish, from a fiscal perspective. So that's embedded in the data. That, of course, when the time comes, when the choices of doing it come, means you have to do it. So that's where you touch on institutions and the importance of institutions. Another part I did not emphasize in the chapter, but I think is very important, is the box we have that actually Josef did, where you look at the importance of institutions in relation to the interest rate. So the worldwide interest rate and advanced economies interest rates were going down. That's great, but not the interest rates of all emerging markets. So one interesting part in that box is that the interest rates of emerging markets that have robust institutions are expected to follow. So let's say if the chapter says interest rates are expected to eventually go towards the direction of the past, that hinges on institutions. And then there were questions of the anchors, etc. Our chapter is not about optimal fiscal policy, so I cannot say anything from the chapter. Of course, that is a discussion that is ongoing. People in my department have worked a lot on issues of using spreads and using a more risk-based approach that I touched on before. The challenge there is what is the right variable. Spreads sometimes people say are too volatile, right? So there are animal spirits, panics, etc. And you may not want to react immediately to today's panic. So you have to filter it somehow. That is more of the frontier of research, but definitely important to touch upon. So maybe I take it there for some more questions.
So, Andres, one of the policy proposals you mentioned for increasing long-term growth is increasing formalization, because we have a very informal labor market. But I see a little contradiction with that proposal because of the pension scheme that we have. So the pay-as-you-go system increases its fiscal cost when we have more formal, when we see an increase in the formal labor market. So how do you address that contradiction between the actual pension scheme we have and the proposal you gave, even more with the policy proposal of the government that proposes increasing the role for the pay-as-you-go system? For Joseph, the R-G discussion is typically given for advanced economies, because in emerging economies with the risk premium we have, typically the interest rate on our debt is very, it's greater than our growth, our real growth of our GDP. So how do you make it a discussion for emerging economies, in spite of the fact that, you know, we have a risk premium and it's very difficult for us to have safe assets? And for JaeBin, one of the graphs you showed, you know, it shows that Latin America will have a zero impact from the increase in geofragmentation. So how do we take advantage of that flowing out of Asia and China and all these China bloc, and to bring them to our countries and to have a positive impact from that geofragmentation, even more when we have, as Sylvia mentioned, tax reforms every 1.5 years, so it's very difficult to invest, for example, in Colombia. How do we take advantage of that situation in geopolitics? Thank you.
I will let you answer. Those are the presenters. No, I would say just one short thing, and it's our pension reform is maybe a step forward, given the current situation of formality. Now, if we increase formality, then we have to do another reform. But this is a step forward, given the current situation. If we keep increasing formality and productivity and all that, then we should think in another reform.
Yeah, on the R-G question for emerging markets, I think Adrian touched on it before. So that's so I was actually also involved in their chapter, and there we look at how did interest rates evolve in emerging markets, because it's kind of known that in advanced economies they were on this downward trend, and you might remember the chart. And what we find for emerging markets on average since 2000, I mean, you have some data issues there. Since 2000, the interest rates didn't really go down so much. However, when we focus in on the specific countries, in particular those with good institutions, then we find a decline in interest rates. So I think, and that this would directly help for R-G dynamics, because you bring the R down, keeping the G relatively constant. Because one lesson from what we do in my chapter is, if R goes down, that's not enough. You have to look at the G as well. If G goes down for the same reasons, like demographic change and aging population and a decline in TFP growth, then it doesn't really help so much for the R-G dynamics.
Okay, and thank you very much for a very nice question. And yes, that's a very important part of the result, and you made a correct observation that Latin American countries and India and Indonesia, those are the non-aligned groups, and that's why their overall economic impact was negligible, close to zero. That is because of relative to other countries, they are only getting this negative effect from direct lower capital accumulation and lower spillovers. But these countries, Latin American countries and non-aligned countries, they can benefit from diversion from those aligned countries. So FDI will divert toward these countries. So they get a relative benefit from that. But still, the net effect was close to zero, but it was in negative area because the overall lower, weaker external demand from world economic losses were dominating this diversion effect. So that was the reason. But we actually played with different parameter values for elasticity of substitution. So for example, if we allow for such kind of FDI diversion to be happening even in greater power than baseline scenario, then we can observe that actually there will be a net positive effect for Latin American countries or India and Indonesian countries. So that highlights the importance of attracting more FDIs for these non-aligned countries at the cost of these aligned countries, which goes directly to your policy implications. So what will be needed for countries like Colombia or other non-aligned countries to benefit the most and become the relative winner of this political situation? And one simple answer could be like an informality issue. So if you could reduce informality, it will be good for not just for this debt perspective, fiscal perspective, but also to the extent that this large informality is kind of barriers for foreign direct investment for multinational corporations, then there will be also the good policy suggestion for increasing FDI, and also some kinds of labor market rigidity issues. So not just for informality, but even for formal labor sectors, to the extent that the current degree of labor market rigidity in Colombia could be a little bit too much to attract as much FDI from other foreign countries, then it may be also an area where you can consider to make it a little bit more flexible. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to our presenters, and looking forward for the next presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you for the question.